Forget the glistening white marble columns, the majestic temples, and the pristine togas you usually see in Hollywood epics or the polished illustrations of traditional history books. The Rome I am going to present to you today is not in the tourist guides, and even less so in the heroic speeches of the senators. It smells of open sewers, boiling oil, stagnant urine, and a constant dread that floats in the air like a thick, suffocating mist. You are looking now at a Roman legionary, the most lethal, disciplined, and relentless soldier antiquity has ever known. Men who marched thousands of miles through sun and snow, who crushed entire empires and made powerful kings kneel before the golden metal eagle. But for these elite men, veterans of 1,000 battles, there was a fate considered far worse than facing a horde of Germanic barbarians in a dark, unknown forest. That fate was being assigned to patrol the Suburra, in the heart of the largest and most powerful capital of the ancient world. There existed a labyrinth where Caesar's law simply ceased to exist as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. A place where experienced generals retreated and where military patrols were hunted like cornered animals from the windows of crumbling buildings. Have you ever seriously stopped to wonder why the most powerful empire in history had an absolute terror of a single neighborhood within its own capital? What exactly happened in the damp, narrow alleys of the Suburra that made the strongest army on earth feel completely helpless, vulnerable, and humiliated? Today, we are going to cross the wall that Rome built to hide its own shame, its rot, and its darkest sins. And what we find inside is not just an ancient history lesson. It is something real, brutal, bloody, and deeply disturbing to any modern mind. To understand the visceral dread of the legions, you first need to visualize the physical and psychological barrier that was deliberately created by the central power. Emperor Augustus was not just a political leader, he was a master of propaganda and a strategist who knew better than anyone the explosive danger of the desperate human mass. He knew that the Suburra was a powder keg ready to explode and swallow the Roman Forum in flames, screams, and violence at any moment of instability. Therefore, he ordered the construction of something that defies the logic of civil engineering and urban coexistence of the time, a colossal wall of raw stone 100 feet high. This is not a conspiracy theory or an internet myth to attract clicks. The wall of the Suburra still stands in the center of Rome, firm, silent, and menacing after more than 2,000 years of history. If you walk through Italy today, you will see this wall of dark volcanic rock known as Peperino, separating the luxury and order of the Forum of Augustus from the absolute chaos of what was once the most dangerous ghetto in the known world. This wall was not built to protect the residents of the Suburra against external invaders or barbarians. It served as a sanitary and social containment barrier, an isolation wall to ensure that the frequent fires, the bubonic plague, and the rampant criminality of that underworld did not contaminate the Rome of the nobles and the gods. It was the first system of social segregation on a monumental scale in human history. Rome built a wall high, enough to be able to close its eyes and pretend that the Suburra and its millions of wretches simply did not exist. But what happened when someone needed to cross that wall? Imagine yourself walking along the street of the Argiletum. This was the main artery that connected the beating heart of Roman power, the Forum, to the city's rotten stomach, the Suburra. At the beginning of the walk, you step on travertine marble, hear the sound of harps, and smell the expensive incense burning in the temples. But as you advance just 300 yards, the scenery undergoes a grotesque mutation. The marble gives way to packed earth and foul mud. The incense is replaced by the odor of rotting fish and decomposing human flesh. The voices of philosophers are silenced by the cries of loan sharks and the metallic sound of daggers being sharpened. The Argiletum was the frontier between civilization and chaos. Crossing that line was, for many, a point of no return. While the senators and the wealthiest patricians lived on the hilltops, like the Palatine, breathing the fresh morning air and looking out at the empire's infinite horizon, the valley of the Suburra literally received all the physical and human sewage of the city. Geographically, the neighborhood was situated in a deep depression between the Esquiline and Viminal hills. This meant a daily logistical disaster. Every time a storm broke over Rome, heavy mud, waste from the latrines, and the accumulated trash of the rich areas flowed directly downward, stopping at the doorsteps of the residents of the Suburra. The streets were not those wide, paved, clean avenues we see in the romantic illustrations of schoolbooks. They were winding, dark, claustrophobic alleys, less than 6 feet wide in several crucial spots. Try to imagine now an entire Roman legion, trained exhaustively for years to fight in perfect formations 100 yards wide, with their huge rectangular shields and long spears, trying to march inside an alley where 2 adult men could barely pass side by side. The historian Livy reports with terrifying clarity that the Roman army lost all its strength, its morale, and its tactical advantage in confined spaces. In the Suburra, the discipline of the legions, which was their greatest virtue on the battlefields of Gaul, became their death sentence in the alleys of the capital. They entered as invincible soldiers and were quickly transformed into isolated prey, surrounded by shadows that knew every broken brick and every hiding place of that nightmare labyrinth. The mortal danger in the Suburra did not just come from ground level, from the iron daggers hidden in the dirty rags of beggars and street thieves. The real danger came from above, from a height that Roman soldiers, with their bronze helmets, could not monitor or control. Rome was the civilization that invented the world's first mass-produced apartment buildings, the so-called Insulae. But while in the noble neighborhoods they were solid and safe, in the Suburra they were unstable vertical slums, 7, 8, or even 9 stories high. They were constructions erected with the worst and cheapest materials on the market, already rotten wood, poorly fired mud bricks, and a mortar that crumbled at the slightest touch of the valley's constant humidity. One of the most terrifying documented cases was that of the Insula Felicles. This was a building so absurdly tall for the time that historians compare it to the first modern skyscrapers, but its height was its curse. On a stormy night, the mud base of the Insula Felicles simply gave way under the weight of hundreds of crowded families. The building did not just fall, it imploded, dragging the neighboring buildings down with it like a house of cards. The sound of the collapse was heard as far as the Roman Forum, but no one from the army dared to enter the dark alleys to rescue the survivors until dawn. They preferred to let hundreds of people suffocate under the rubble for fear of an ambush in the darkness. The Roman poet Juvenal described life in these buildings in a visceral and devastating way. He wrote that the residents of the Suburra lived supported only by thin, precarious, and creaking stakes. He said that the landlord, the greedy building owner, merely covered the crack of an old fissure with a bit of cheap plaster and told the tenants to sleep soundly, while the entire structure was visibly on the verge of collapsing over their weary heads. Hundreds of people were crushed to death every month in the tenements of the Suburra, victims of silent collapses that happened in the middle of the night. It was unbridled real estate profit prioritized over human life in its purest, most cruel and negligent state. But where there is constant and predictable tragedy, there is also the most sophisticated criminal profit. Marco Licinius. Crassus, the richest man who ever walked the streets of Rome and one of the wealthiest in all of human history, created an extortion scheme that would make any modern organized mob envious. Crassus quickly realized that the Suburra burned almost every week due to unstable oil lamps and precarious kitchens inside the dry wooden buildings. So he did not create a charity. He created his own private fire brigade, composed of 500 slaves who were elite architects and firefighters. When a large building in the Suburra began to burn and the screams of absolute terror from the families trapped inside filled the night air, Crassus would arrive at the scene with his team and simply stop in front of the flames. He did not lift a finger to help anyone. While the fire consumed the possessions, memories and lives of the residents, Crassus would calmly approach the building owner in total despair and offer to buy the property right then and there, while it was still burning, for a pittance. It was a tiny fraction of the land's real value. If the owner refused the humiliating offer, Crassus would cross his arms and watch the building turn to ash and the tenants die in the fire. If the owner accepted out of pure panic and the need to save what was left, Crassus would give the signal. His slaves would extinguish the fire with surgical precision, and he would rebuild the place to profit even greater fortunes. This was how Crassus became the largest property owner in all of ancient Rome, building his unbeatable financial empire on the trauma, the black smoke, and the charred bodies of the poor of the Suburra. Crassus did not sell safety. He sold survival for ransom. If the army was afraid to enter, if the emperor preferred to build stone walls, and if the official law of the Senate had no reach, who really governed that urban chaos? The answer lay buried in the shadows of the so-called collegia. They were, in legal theory, workers' guilds and religious associations, but in the daily practice of the Suburra, they acted as organized, violent, and highly efficient mafias. These secret societies and neighborhood groups controlled the black market for wheat, the trafficking of illegally captured slaves, clandestine gambling, and the city's most dangerous prostitution. Within these collegia, there was a special caste, the sicari. The name comes from the sica, a small curved dagger that could be easily hidden under a tunic. The sicarius of the Suburra was the ultimate professional of death. He did not kill out of hatred, but by contract. Imagine a Roman noble who needed to remove an unwanted heir without attracting the attention of the Praetorian Guard. He would send a discreet messenger to the blacksmith's alley in the Suburra. There, for a handful of denarii, he bought eternal silence. The sicarius did not wear armor. He used the crowd as a shield. He would approach the target in a noisy market, drive the blade between the ribs, and vanish before the body even hit the ground. If a Roman soldier, moved by foolish courage or a direct order, dared to enter alone or in a small group into a deep alley of the Suburra to try to collect an overdue tax or arrest a known criminal, a signal was given from window to window, from roof to roof. The favorite and most feared attack by the residents against the military was the so-called rain of oil. From the windows of the highest floors of the Insulae, where sunlight never reached, they poured immense cauldrons of boiling oil, acidic urine, and human waste onto the patrols passing below. Because the streets were extremely narrow and the buildings disproportionately tall, the soldiers could not raise their heavy wooden shields in time to protect themselves from the scalding liquid that entered through the gaps in their armor. It was a primitive but lethal form of guerrilla warfare, practiced 2000 years before this concept was even theorized by modern military manuals. Entire patrols of the vigils, the police and fire force of the time simply disappeared in the alleys of the Suburra, and their remains were never found by official authorities. But there was a danger even more silent than the sicarius's dagger: poison. The Suburra was the headquarters of Rome's poisoners. Women like the legendary Locusta operated in clandestine laboratories hidden in the damp basements of the Uii neighborhood. They mixed hemlock, arsenic, and poisonous fungi to create potions that killed without leaving a trace. If you wanted to eliminate a wealthy husband or a political rival without the blood of the dagger, you sought the venum mortis of the Suburra. It was here, between the peeling walls of these alleys, that the poisons were prepared that killed emperors and changed the course of world history. The Roman army could win battles, but it could not fight against a drop of colorless liquid in a cup of wine. Life inside the Suburra was not just dangerous, it was a sensory experience of pure horror. Historians estimate that the population density in the neighborhood was up to 10 times higher than that of any modern high-density slum. Imagine the constant noise, the creaking of the wood of unstable buildings, the cries of street vendors offering meat of dubious origin, the sound of fights on every corner, and the clamor of taverns that never closed. So the food in the Suburra was a case, a part of crime against public health. Bread was often mixed with chalk or sand to increase its weight, and the wine was an acidic mixture of vinegar and resin that corroded the workers' stomachs. Diseases like typhoid and malaria were endemic, as the humid valley and stagnant waters were the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes and rats that circulated freely between the living and the abandoned dead. It was common to find the bodies of the destitute left in the alleys for days until the cleanup authorities resolved to remove them to common graves outside the walls. And it is here that we find the most bizarre contrast in Rome's history. In the same alley where a Sicarius cleaned the blood from his knife, a group of people gathered in absolute silence to pray. The Suburra was one of the first refugees for Christians in Rome. Because it was a place where the police and the army feared to enter, the followers of this new, forbidden religion found safety among the criminals. In the catacombs and basements of the Suburra, the message of love and forgiveness was preached just yards away from brothels and gambling houses. The neighborhood judged no one. To the Suburra, it did not matter if you were a saint or a monster. If you were fleeing the law of Rome, you were one of them. This explosive mix of radical faith and brutal criminality made the neighborhood a zone of exclusion impossible to govern. However, the filthiest, most hypocritical, and best-kept secret of the entire empire was that the Roman elite, the same elite that pretended to hate and be disgusted by the Suburra, simply could not survive without it. The neighborhood was Rome's dark room, the forbidden place where all the vices and unmentionable desires could be satisfied far from the judgmental eyes of the Senate. High-influence politicians, generals decorated with laurel wreaths, and even the emperors themselves, the living gods on earth, used the total anonymity of those filthy alleys to commit crimes, orgies, and acts of debauchery that official morality would never tolerate. The historian Suetonius reports that Emperor Nero used to flee his luxurious palace atop the Palatine, disguised as a common slave. He would infiltrate the most dangerous taverns of the Suburra to participate in bloody street fights, rob small shops, and even commit random murders for pure sadistic pleasure. Nero knew very well that there, in that lawless territory, no one would dare report a disguised attacker, and even if they knew who he was, the dread of the Suburra would silence any witness. The neighborhood was the Roman elite's blood playground, the place where the powerful washed their marble hands with the filth of the underworld. In addition to Nero, other names of the high Roman nobility were cited in scandals involving the Suburra. Empress Messalina, the wife of Claudius, was famous for rumors that she frequented the neighborhood under the pseudonym Lysiska to work in popular brothels, seeking a debauchery that the palace could not offer. Although some historians debate the total veracity of these accounts, the fact that such stories were believable to Romans of the time shows how much the Suburra was seen as the place where all social masks fell. It was the perfect ecosystem for espionage. If you wanted to take down a rival in the Senate, you didn't hire an assassin in a rich villa. You sent a discreet messenger to the shadows of the Suburra to find a Sicarius who would vanish into thin air immediately after the job. The neighborhood was Rome's black lung, breathing in what the city could not process and exhaling death and conspiracy. But why then, with all the unquestionable power of the legions and the brilliant engineering of the aqueducts, did the Roman Empire never decide to clean up the Suburra once and for all? Why did they never send 10 entire legions with express orders to tear down every crooked building, burn every infected alley, and rebuild everything from scratch? The historical truth behind this colossal omission is much more cynical than simple military incompetence. The Roman Empire desperately needed that human sewer to continue functioning as a global power machine. The elite of Rome needed a specific geographic location where crime could be safely outsourced and where the most delicate political assassinations could be planned without leaving an official trail. The Suburra was the inexhaustible reservoir of cheap, desperate, and completely disposable labor that kept the heavy machinery of the empire turning. It was the exact place where you hired a hitman to eliminate a political rival for a few dirty silver coins, or where you bought forbidden information that could bring down governments. The existence of the Suburra was a necessary evil, a fundamental and hidden piece in the chess game, for the maintenance of the absolute power of the rich and clean hills of Rome. The economic underworld of the Suburra also included the counterfeiting of coins on an industrial scale. In hidden and damp basements, skilled artisans melted down the official silver denarius and mixed it with copper, creating fake coins that flooded the market and corroded the empire's economy from within. The government knew this, but the police raids were so dangerous and inefficient that often imperial inspectors accepted generous bribes to look the other way. Furthermore, slave trafficking in the Suburra was of a cruelty without parallel. While official markets showed healthy men and women, in the Suburra, the broken ones were sold. Sickly slaves, the elderly, or fugitives bought for work that no one else would accept. The Suburra is the final historical proof that behind every great civilization that proclaims itself glorious, enlightened, and eternal, there is always a dark, foul-smelling and forgotten alley that no one has the courage to look at head-on for long. The wall of Augustus is still there today, standing in the heart of modern Italy as a raw stone scar that silently reminds us that the most powerful army humanity has ever known was defeated not by foreign barbarians armed to the teeth, but by mud, organized crime, and the despair of a neighborhood they themselves helped create with their own negligence and boundless greed. If you were transported right now to the year 50 AD and had to spend just a single night in those dark alleys of the Suburra, what would you choose to ensure your minimum survival until dawn? The theoretical protection of a Roman soldier with his glistening armor, or the sharp knife and the knowledge of the shadows of a local criminal who knows every corner of that underworld? Think carefully about your answer, because in the Roman underworld, your military uniform was not a symbol of divine authority. It was merely a stamped invitation to your own funeral in an unmarked mass grave. Even with the passing of centuries and the eventual fall of Rome, the spirit of the Suburra did not die. It merely transformed. Many of the methods of social control and the power dynamics between slums and modern centers of power find their roots in the cruel lessons learned in the valley between the Esquiline and the Viminal. The official history we read in school books is almost always written by the winners, filtered through the morality of each era and carefully engraved on expensive marble monuments that time eventually corrodes. But the real history, the one that pulses with the rhythm of the human heart, that bleeds and that smells of visceral fear, is written in the dark alleys that time and official historians have tried to erase from our collective memory for centuries. Rome did not fall only because of the great barbarian invasions on its distant borders or the obvious corruption of its decaying leaders at the top of absolute power. Rome was already rotting from within in the damp and forgotten tenements of the Suburra, long before the first Visigoth warrior dared to cross the sacred borders of the empire with a thirst for conquest. The real fall began in the sewer, not on the golden throne. If you felt the real weight of this historical secret and want to continue discovering the brutal truths that the system prefers to keep buried under the ancient ruins, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on all notifications so you don't miss anything. In our next encounter, we are going to dive deep into the real story of the only woman who was so lethal, intelligent, and influential that she made the entire Roman Senate tremble with genuine pavor without ever needing to wield a single sword in public or lead a legion. Prepare your psychological state and your curiosity, because our journey through the blue ocean of forbidden history, ancient true crime, and the secrets of the shadows is just beginning. Until next time, if you have the courage necessary to continue walking with me in the shadows of the real history that no one ever had the audacity to tell you in the classroom.